Hi, IBD. I'm Meredith Heyman. This is Industry Insights. Thanks so much for joining me. Biotech stocks have roared back this year, posting solid gains after a sluggish 2024. The Spider Biotech ETF is up more than 30%, significantly outpacing the S&P 500 index. As the industry continues to focus on next-generation obesity treatments, precision medicine, and AI advancements, will the medical sector remain a healthy investment in 2026? Daniel Chancellor, VP of Thought Leadership at Norstella, is here for a checkup on biotech stocks. All right, well, let's start by talking about advances in weight loss medication and GLP-1 drugs. What can we expect to see coming to the market next year? Oral treatments on the horizon?
Well, it should be a pretty busy year in terms of news flow. I mean, I was looking at this morning, we have 36 GLP-1 agonists or kind of similar type drugs in phase three at the moment, another 40 in phase two. So I think we can expect a really steady cadence of new clinical data that will help further inform valuations or timings and the competitive scenario. What I'm expecting for 26 is actually probably more of, yeah, there's going to be some interesting new data, but I'm looking mostly at still the dynamic between Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. This year was the year in which their two drugs, semaglutide, tirzepatide, actually became the highest selling drugs on the market. So over Keytruda was dethroned. Next year, we're going to see continued momentum. This is a $90 billion market. We've seen price cuts in the US. We've seen this, which will help improve access. This could potentially afford a bit of an opportunity for a reset, especially as supply goes up. Hopefully, there's compounding is less of an issue, these compounding pharmacies. So the narrative so far has been very much that Eli Lilly has won the GLP-1 race. But with these dynamics, and in particular with the price changes and improved access, then there is an opportunity for this kind of Novo v Lilly race to be revisited on their first generation or on their current injectables. Of course, to have the next generation, we may see Eli Lilly's oral come to market next year and start to, gain some patient uptake. The reality is we're expecting the market really to be dominated by the two main injectable versions of Lilly and Novo for the foreseeable. Yeah, there's going to be some exciting orals and other combinations and other types of drugs, but realistically, these are going to have a minority market share, at least for the medium term. Lots of exciting news, lots of potentially new market entrants and fragmentation of the market, but I would still focus primarily on that big picture dynamic between Novo and Lilly and market share.
And how is the rise of artificial intelligence influencing clinical trials and speeding up therapeutic developments?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned clinical trials. A lot of the narrative around AI in our industry so far has actually been preclinical. So optimizing the design of molecules, choosing the right candidate to bring it forward into clinical trials. And there are some biotechs that are very well marketed as AI biotechs that are able to shave months off that development timeline. But really, for AI to have the kind of transformational effect that to realize its true potential, I think we need to harness its ability within clinical trials. This is where the majority of time is spent in R&D. This is where the majority of budget is spent in R&D. And yet, I think the uptake of AI in a lot of the processes around clinical trials are still pretty not too far removed from how they have been for decades. Certainly, when we look at what we're building internally, we have the ability to apply our algorithms and real world data and our vast data sets of clinical trials to help companies run smarter protocols, predict which sites and investigators they should be working with, even find patients that are precisely matched to pretty sophisticated inclusion and exclusion criteria. As these types of tools are more embedded, then we can actually really expect pharma to move the needle in terms of its R&D efficiency. This will really make a big difference when it comes to cycle times, when it comes to cost, because these two things are kind of either holding steady or getting progressively worse. So certainly AI has a huge role to play in efficiency in clinical trials. We look forward to seeing this, this uptake and these tools become more widespread in the next few years.
And Daniel, how are potential tariffs and drug price policies impacting the sector?
It's a good question. I mean, my sense is that the real impact has probably fallen short of the headlines that have been out there. If we start first with tariffs, you could say these have been largely mitigated through this US manufacturing drive. Even today, it's still in the news. The UK and the US has agreed a 0% tariff. So that's like clearly a good tailwind for the sector there. The pricing changes at the moment, these look relatively well contained within certain channels, within government channels. But there are some real long-term implications, I think, that some of these measures are causing. We see this move towards direct to patients, the business model where pharma is going direct to patients. That has been accelerated by this current administration. We see a squeezing of middlemen, of PBMs, as pharma companies go direct to patients. And we're also seeing a bit of a rebalancing of prices globally. For a long time, price growth in the US at the list price has really outstripped what we've seen elsewhere. And it's really created this tremendous price discrepancy or disparity between the US and other markets, including where I live in the UK. And now, certainly as a result of things such as most favored nation and the executive orders that we've been seeing, companies are changing their behaviors. They are leaning on other governments to raise their budgets for pricing, and they are negotiating lower prices in the US. So, long term, there's some real potential tectonic shifts that we are seeing, and I think we're very early into those. But in terms of the most immediate tariffs and most favored nation pricing, in terms of impact to companies this year and next year, I think they probably have been slightly overblown.
And any regulatory updates impacting the sector?
Uh, well, I'd say, I think the thing we're following is approval counts. So I mean, there's a lot has been written about FDA, and clearly there's been a strong amount of turnover and reduction in headcount at FDA. FDA is also on course to approve a smaller number of drugs this year than it previously has done. If we look at FDA's track record in terms of novel drugs, is typically around 60 approvals each year. That's kind of going back the last 5 or 6 years. This year, FDA is on track to approve around about 50, 52 by the end of the year. So a slight dip from that long-term average. Now, the temptation is to look at approval, to map approval numbers to staffing ratios and that kind of thing. The reality is that FDA can only approve what it has in front of it. And so I don't necessarily think there is a gotcha there in terms of FDA's a leaner FDA is able to approve fewer drugs. I think what we probably would expect is that in this year, while the total comes in lower, that kind of creates this bolus, and there's potentially more in the pipeline in the queue for next year. So previously when we've had slow years at FDA, that's been followed by a very productive year in terms of new drug approvals. So yeah, one thing I'd be looking at for 26 is that pace of approvals upticking. And if it isn't, then that's when you might start to think, well, hold on, what's going on here? The drug pipeline is larger than ever. It's growing. We're running more and more clinical trials by all kind of pieces of logic. FDA should be approving more drugs. So I'd expect a rebound to that normal long-term trend, if not slightly higher next year.
And how will the focus on broader metabolic conditions shape the biotech sector in 2026?
Yeah, for sure. This change is really underway. Particularly in the last few years, we've seen a real rebalancing of portfolios. Certain therapy areas are hot, certain therapy areas are less so. And if we look at the changes in the last couple of years, the cardiometabolic space is growing tremendously. Of course, there's that obesity story. But if you're building an obesity pipeline, you also want to be building, portfolios that synergize with them. And what we have seen is large pharma companies have been pivoting and rebalancing to the extent that the cardio-metabolic pipeline was actually the fastest growing part of the industry last year. Pipeline growth was about 11%. This has actually also coincided with, in the cancer space, for the first time in about 2 decades, cancer has grown at a slower rate than average. So, on relative terms, companies we can see are kind of moving away from certain areas that once were a huge, huge focus and into cardiometabolic. So, a bit more on cardiometabolic. I think we saw more than 2,000 industry-sponsored clinical trials last year. It's a really, really fast-growing space. What I'd be looking for next year, we can expect M&A in cardiometabolic as companies are further kind of accelerating their portfolio renewals, in particular in light of their patent cliffs. So some of the companies that I might expect to be more active in this space, Bristol Myers Squibb, Merck, maybe even AstraZeneca, I think they will all be looking at acquisition opportunities in this therapeutic area.
You started to bring up cancer treatments. Let's talk more about how a forecast on that area of the biotech sector will shape the field.
Yeah, cancer is still the biggest area for our industry. It's just in relative terms, it has fallen away ever so slightly. So 2023, potentially oncology hit its ceiling or its peak, where about 40% of drug development was in cancer. Last year, we actually saw that relative growth fall away slightly. So what I'm looking for this year is that, if that happens again, then perhaps we can start to say that oncology has reached the end of its cycle, which has been this tremendous 2 decades of scientific innovation, of new therapeutic breakthroughs, of strong return on investment. That's still there. There's a lot of momentum within oncology R&D still. A lot of these investments will continue to yield new clinical trial results, new drug approvals, new biotechs will be looking at the new targets that are coming through. But in terms of like the big picture investment themes, we do expect that oncology is beginning to fall away slightly, potentially at the expense of areas such as cardiometabolic. Also, if you think about rare diseases, neuroscience, and inflammatory diseases, these are, what we'd be calling the kind of the up on their up cycles, potentially when oncology has reached its peak.
You also brought up biotech M&As. They've been picking up recently. Do we expect to see that continue next year?
I see no reason why not to. This year is been quite remarkable, really. I think we're expecting by year end more than $200 billion of M&A deals being signed between farmers and biotechs. This is in spite of there being that one huge deal that typically propels the value up, but rather it's the sum of some of its parts. We've seen a lot of good size and smaller size deals. If we look at what large pharma needs, there is still a bit of a gap between their current portfolios and their current growth rates as we forecast them to be, what the market average is doing. They are facing these patent cliffs, as I said, and this is causing a bit pressure on their portfolios. And we expect somewhere in the region of $100 billion of revenues, that are kind of a delta between what their current portfolios are set to deliver and what they would aspire to deliver by the end of this decade. Um, that's quite a decent chunk to kind of make up, but M&A is going to be a very strong component of that strategy. We expect significant sums more to be spent on similar types of targets that have been taken out this year. Potentially even, we might even be expecting some larger industry consolidation. I think it's going to be a time of investment for pharma companies, either investing through these M&As or in reinvesting into their pipelines in order to life cycle management type strategies to bridge that 100 billion revenue gap that we see.
All right, Daniel, and one last question. Medical and biotech stocks, they've been one area actually holding up well under the recent market chop. Do you think we'll continue to see that next year?
Well, if we think about the reasons why, certainly M&A has been a strong component of that. This last quarter, we saw a lot of financing and investment as well. So, if this quarter, the pace that we've seen so far holds out until the end of the year, this will have been the best quarter for 4 years in terms of money coming into private companies, public companies, in the reinvesting into their drug development. There's potentially one missing piece of the jigsaw just to kind of really round off that picture of strong health, and that's IPOs. It's still very quiet in terms of IPOs. The quieter it remains, these companies that are, typically might be a candidate, they're maturing all the while. And when they do finally launch onto the public markets, assuming they do so, they're going to be that much more mature, that much closer to their real value inflection points. So I do expect there to be a lot of interest from investors in the kind of the next cohort of IPOs. So yeah, that's the one thing I'd be looking at. Is that window opening? Is there going to be a more steady trickle of new companies onto the public markets? That will really round out that picture and really help capital flow through the system, and suggest that this market recovery that we're seeing is sustainable and for the long term.
All right, Daniel. Well, we'll be watching. Thanks so much for joining me. This is Industry Insights. I'm Meredith Heyman. Stay right here on IBD for more. We'll see you next time.